The spring air of 1940 carried something more than the usual promise of renewal. It carried the roar of German steel cutting through the Ardennes like a blade through silk. French soldiers who had strutted with pride in their mechanical beasts now found themselves frozen in horror. Their nation had birthed the tank during the First Great War. Now they watched their armored dreams crumble into dust. The collapse left invisible scars on every man who lived through it. These wounds festered for 4 long years. When liberation finally whispered through occupied streets in 1944, the pain remained fresh as an open cut. French officers could not forget the sight of their mighty Char B1 heavy tanks sitting helpless. These machines had seemed invincible on paper. Thick armor plating, powerful guns. Yet they became death traps through incompetence and neglect. Poor planning scattered them across the countryside. Fuel shortages left them stranded like beached whales. Luftwaffe dive bombers picked them apart, one by one. Steel fortresses transformed into metal coffins. Military doctrine had betrayed them completely. The word tank made French soldiers in 1944 shudder with conflicted emotions. Awe mixed with terror in equal measure. The memories burned bright in their minds. German panzer formations had swept past their positions like wolves through sheep. Tank tracks clattered against ancient cobblestones. Villages fell in rapid succession. The sound echoed in nightmares years later. Comrades fled before the mechanical onslaught. Those who survived captivity carried deeper wounds than any bullet could create. Others melted into the resistance movement. All bore the shame of watching France's armored might crumble. To these broken soldiers, armor meant failure. It represented everything cumbersome and useless about their military. They had learned to see tanks as liabilities instead of weapons. Liberation seemed impossible when their defenders moved like slugs. Whispered conversations in hiding places always returned to the same bitter truth. Nothing could match the lightning speed of German war machines. 6 weeks was all it took to shatter their nation. The occupation that followed hammered this lesson deeper into their souls. 4 years stretched like an eternity. French soldiers rotted in prisoner camps. Others crept through shadows as partisans. Humiliation and hunger became daily companions. The proud army that once paraded down grand boulevards existed only in fading photographs. Underground meetings filled basement rooms and barn lofts. Resistance fighters gathered around flickering candles to share intelligence. Speculation about the promised Allied invasion dominated these sessions. Some imagined British armor rolling to their rescue. The Matilda tank appeared in their conversations. So did the Churchill with its massive bulk. These machines represented grinding power designed to smash through fortifications. American armor remained largely mysterious. Few had actually seen one with their own eyes. Vague rumors drifted through the resistance network like smoke. Most French fighters could only dream of such machines. Tanks remained abstract concepts in their minds. They symbolized powerful allies who might someday appear. But clear pictures of what liberation would look like remained fuzzy. The truth would have shocked them. America was preparing something that defied all expectations. The United States Army had studied the disasters of 1940 with scientific precision. Their conclusions led to radical changes. Static defense belonged to the past. Movement, coordination, and speed would define the future. The Sherman tank embodied this new philosophy completely. Weight mattered less than reliability. Individual power meant nothing compared to mobility. Sheer numbers would overwhelm any defense. French soldiers training with Free French forces caught glimpses of this revolution. Tales filtered back from North Africa and Britain. These stories seemed too fantastic to believe. The Sherman could march hundreds of kilometers without mechanical failure. Repairs took hours instead of days. Endless columns rolled like rivers of liquid steel. They never stopped moving forward, never paused to rest. Men who remembered the sluggish French tanks of 1940 found such claims impossible. It sounded like propaganda designed to boost morale. When Operation Overlord finally brought Allied armies across the English Channel, French fighters in Normandy braced for familiar sounds. Artillery barrages, bomber formations, waves of infantry charging forward. Few expected the earth-shaking rumble of American tank columns advancing inland. Their conception of armored warfare was about to be shattered forever. Past defeats had planted deep seeds of skepticism. The idea that any armor could outmatch German panzers seemed like wishful thinking. Night sounds still triggered memories of approaching tank treads. The feeling of helplessness when escape proved impossible. Watching French machines break down in the middle of crucial advances. To imagine that liberators might bring something faster and stronger seemed almost cruel. A joke played by fate on desperate people. Yet they stood on the edge of 1944, ready to take up arms again. Soon they would discover that Americans had built more than just a weapon. They had created something relentless, something that would forever change how they understood armored combat. The French soldier of 1944 carried ghosts in his heart. Occupation had hardened him like steel in a forge. But memories of sudden collapse haunted every quiet moment. He survived on scraps of food and fragments of hope. Rumors of Allied strength kept him breathing. When he finally encountered American tanks face to face, the experience transcended mere machinery. He would witness the embodiment of revolutionary doctrine, a promise that history's darkest chapters need not repeat themselves. But understanding that moment required appreciating his profound disbelief. The shadow of 1940 stretched across everything. Without grasping the depth of that despair, the shock of America's mechanical speed in 1944 lost all meaning. By 1941, France existed as two broken pieces. The occupied North groaned under German jackboots. The collaborationist Vichy regime controlled the southern regions. Ordinary French soldiers who escaped capture limped home in humiliation. Life became defined by silence and endless waiting. Proud regiments that once marched down the Champs-Élysées survived only in fading memories. German patrols now claimed those sacred streets. Café conversations dropped to whispers when uniforms appeared. Men who once wore military insignia with pride now gathered in dim barns. They spoke of sabotage and resistance in hushed voices. Their weapons consisted of ancient hunting rifles. A few pistols passed secretly between trusted hands. The notion of confronting German armor with such pathetic tools seemed laughable. Tanks had transformed from symbols of liberation into monuments of overwhelming enemy power. The resistance possessed virtually no armored vehicles. A handful of French tanks lay hidden in remote barns. Others sat camouflaged in distant fields. Fuel shortages made them worthless relics. German patrols made discovery a constant terror. The mighty Char B1s that once seemed invincible now served as German trophies. Enemy crews operated them under new insignia. For French fighters, seeing a tank inspired nothing but despair. Each sighting reminded them of their nation's shattered defenses. They had learned a bitter lesson in 1940. Mobility and speed crushed everything in their path. That truth poisoned their imagination completely. The enemy possessed fast, decisive weapons. The French had absolutely nothing. The resistance grew bolder as time crawled forward. By 1943, rail line sabotage became more coordinated. Attacks on German convoys increased in frequency and effectiveness. Yet even the bravest fighters could not forget their enemies' seemingly untouchable armored columns. They dreamed of help arriving from across the sea. Every whisper of an Allied landing sent ripples of desperate hope through their ranks. American leaflets dropped from aircraft became precious treasures. French fighters clutched them like sacred relics of a promised future. Still, memories of past defeat bred deep caution. Would the Allies arrive with machines capable of matching German panzer divisions? The same divisions that had crushed France so completely? Or would they witness history's cruelest repetition? Far from occupied France, in North African deserts, French soldiers with the Free French forces began glimpsing American power. Operation Torch in late 1942 brought new possibilities. French units received American equipment and training. They worked alongside U.S. forces for the first time. Many saw their first Sherman tank in those scorching sands. Its broad tracks and rounded turret seemed almost modest at first glance, certainly less imposing than the legendary German Tigers they had heard described. But watching Shermans move across desert terrain with unprecedented speed and endurance changed everything. These machines did not stall after a few short kilometers. They refused to choke on swirling dust clouds. Overheating under the brutal sun never stopped them. They simply rolled forward with mechanical persistence, like steel beasts bred specifically for constant movement. French officers who had doubted American claims began quiet discussions among themselves. Perhaps these Americans had indeed mastered the art of fighting Germans on equal terms. For the vast majority of French fighters still trapped at home, these revelations remained unknown secrets. They waited in villages and farms. They hid in city cellars, planning acts of sabotage with whatever resources they could gather. Living half-lives defined their existence. Farmers during daylight hours. Partisans when darkness fell. Always listening for the sound of German boots on cobblestones. Tanks remained part of their nightmares, rather than sources of hope. Hushed voices admitted the truth to one another. Only overwhelming Allied armor could possibly turn the tide of war. Yet skepticism ran deeper than ocean trenches. They had been promised salvation before. In 1940, that salvation never materialized. The contrast between occupied reality and unseen preparations across the Channel defined this period of agonizing waiting. French soldiers in hiding measured time differently than ordinary people. Not in months or years, but in fragments of rumors. Rumors of an Allied fleet gathering strength. Rumors of American weapons being mass-produced. Rumors of tanks that could actually outpace German panzers. While they dreamed of such miraculous machines, belief proved impossible. They had lived too long under defeat's crushing shadow to imagine salvation arriving with mechanical swiftness. Only when steel and thunder finally rolled across their beloved homeland would those doubts be obliterated forever. But during these endless years of waiting, disbelief served as their only protective armor. When Allied forces finally crossed the English Channel in June 1944, the French countryside trembled with electric anticipation. For years, whispers had drifted like smoke through occupied territories. An invasion was coming. American soldiers with strange accents and seemingly endless supplies would arrive. This time, the Germans would not be able to halt the advancing tide. For men who had lived through 1940's bitter collapse and occupation's crushing weight, these rumors felt almost like fantasies. Liberation had become a word repeated so often that it seemed to lose concrete meaning. Yet on Normandy's blood-soaked beaches, fantasy suddenly crystallized into reality. French fighters and terrified civilians strained their eyes to see what kind of power their allies would bring ashore. The first French soldiers to establish contact with American forces were immediately struck by contrasts that seemed almost surreal. The GIs themselves looked completely different from British troops many had encountered in exile. Their uniforms appeared more practical than formal. Their equipment seemed plentiful beyond imagination. Their manner projected confidence without aristocratic aloofness. They spoke with easy informality that shocked class-conscious French observers. Cigarettes, chocolate, and chewing gum appeared like magic from their pockets. Such luxuries had become unimaginable under occupation's grinding poverty. To weary French people who had learned to survive on scraps, this abundance felt almost as shocking as the sheer numbers of men pouring across the beaches. Yet it was the machines, those hulking metallic shapes rumbling behind the infantry, that drew the most astonished stares. For many Frenchmen, the only tanks they could remember were the slow, angular Char B1s. Or the antiquated Renaults that had failed them so catastrophically in 1940. The Germans, on the other hand, had filled their nightmares with terrifying images of panzers advancing faster than any defense could possibly stop them. Now, rolling through hedgerows and muddy Norman fields, came something completely unexpected. American Sherman tanks appeared in groups of dozens. They moved in tight formation, with confidence that felt alien to French eyes. At first sight, some French fighters remained unimpressed. The Shermans lacked the brutal silhouette of a Tiger tank. They seemed smaller than the monstrous machines featured in German propaganda films. But as the columns passed by, their speed and rhythmic precision revealed something remarkable. These were not isolated giants crawling forward to inevitable ambush. They formed parts of a living, breathing mechanical system. The sound was unlike anything French ears had heard before. Engines hummed in synchronized rhythm, like some mechanical orchestra. Their tracks cut across muddy fields without hesitation or pause. The Shermans did not crawl along like wounded animals. They flowed like liquid metal given form and purpose. Resistance fighters crouching at village edges found themselves struggling to process what they witnessed. Others stood cautiously at country crossroads, mouths hanging open in disbelief. Could tanks really move with such fluid grace? Could they maintain pace with trucks, infantry, and artillery in one seamless advance? To men accustomed to tanks stalling, breaking down, or falling hopelessly behind, the sight was absolutely transformative. For the first time, armor seemed less like a burden and more like a genuine force of liberation. In one small Norman town, villagers recalled later how American columns seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition followed closely behind the tanks. This ensured the advance never slowed or faltered. French soldiers who had joined the resistance and now attached themselves to American units realized something crucial. These machines were supported in ways their own had never been. Fuel dumps appeared like magic. Mobile workshops materialized when needed. Spare parts flowed in endless streams. Everything was planned so the tanks could maintain their relentless rolling advance. It was this reliability, this logistical depth, that astonished observers the most. The memory of 1940 had taught them that any tank, regardless of power, became useless when stranded without fuel or repair facilities. Yet here, in the summer of 1944, they saw machines that seemed immune to such fundamental failures. The Americans themselves treated their tanks not as sacred, irreplaceable treasures, but as practical tools of war. If one broke down, another immediately took its place. If a Sherman was destroyed by enemy fire, more always appeared. French fighters noticed how casually American crews joked about their machines. They called them Ronsons or Tommy Cookers with dark humor, even while maintaining complete confidence in their mobility and effectiveness. To French eyes, accustomed to scarcity and devastating loss, this abundance bordered on the unbelievable. It was as though the Americans possessed an endless reservoir of steel and fuel hidden just across the Atlantic Ocean. The psychological effect proved immediate and profound. French soldiers who had doubted their nation's future began to feel cautious pride stirring in their hearts. They saw that the tide was finally turning, not just because of superior numbers, but because of revolutionary speed. These American tanks did not pause to rest. They did not stumble over obstacles. They did not surrender precious momentum to enemy pressure. They moved as if the very concept of retreat had been permanently erased from military doctrine. As they watched Sherman after Sherman roll past their positions, French fighters began to believe something they had thought impossible. Perhaps, at last, the nightmare of 1940 could be completely erased, not with empty words or political promises, but with the relentless thunder of American tank tracks grinding German resistance into dust. For French soldiers who had endured occupation's long, dark years, the first extended sight of Sherman tank columns advancing inland was an experience that bordered on the supernatural. They were accustomed to thinking of tanks as rare, lumbering machines, symbols of bygone defeat rather than pathways to victory. Yet here in 1944, as American forces pushed through Normandy's dense bocage country, French eyes witnessed something entirely different. Steel waves rolled forward in unbroken succession. Their movement appeared confident, almost casual, as though nothing in the world could possibly stop their advance. The Shermans did not travel alone like lost wanderers. They came in long columns that stretched beyond the visible horizon. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and armored cars supported them. A complete mechanized ecosystem that made French soldiers realize how far their own army had fallen behind by 1940. The sheer density of movement was overwhelming to witness. Men who had once seen isolated French tanks stranded on roadsides now stared in utter disbelief. The Americans brought armor in numbers that seemed mathematically impossible. It was not simply one or two tanks per village, but dozens upon dozens, each one ready for immediate combat, each one backed by a logistics network that appeared limitless. At first, some French fighters doubted the machines themselves. The Shermans looked smaller than the terrifying Tigers featured in German propaganda. Their armor appeared less imposing than expected. Their guns seemed modest compared to legendary weapons. But then they saw how Shermans actually behaved in combat situations. Unlike the ponderous French Char B1, which required coordination the Army had never mastered, these tanks moved with startling fluidity. They wove through narrow Norman lanes like dancers. They crested hills at surprising speed. They turned with agility that completely belied their mechanical bulk. They did not halt to form grandiose battle lines. They simply pressed forward, always in motion, always advancing. For French eyes trained to expect hesitation and breakdown, it was a complete awakening to new possibilities. One resistance fighter recalled later how the ground shook continuously for hours as Shermans rumbled past his village. He described the sound as both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Terrifying because it evoked vivid memories of German armor sweeping through in 1940. Exhilarating because this time the columns were friendly, bringing liberation instead of conquest. French soldiers who marched beside them could scarcely believe the incredible tempo of advance. They moved like cavalry, one astonished officer remarked, amazed at the pace of American progress. It was as though the ancient traditions of mobility and warfare had been reborn in steel. The French, who had once prided themselves on their light cavalry, felt a flicker of recognition and returning pride. The psychological contrast to 1940 could not have been more dramatic. Then, French tanks had been superior on paper in many respects. Heavier armor plating, larger, more powerful guns. But they were scattered like leaves, misused by incompetent commanders, and starved of essential support. In 1944, the Americans demonstrated what massed armor truly meant in practice. The Shermans were not designed to duel German Tigers one-on-one like medieval knights. They were created to swarm, to move, to overwhelm through sheer mechanical momentum. French soldiers observing this revolutionary doctrine felt as if they were witnessing an entirely different kind of warfare. It was not about individual machines proving their technical superiority. It was about entire formations acting like a single living organism with unified purpose. As tanks moved through liberated towns, French civilians lined the streets cheering and throwing flowers in celebration. But the soldiers among them studied the machines with more critical, professional eyes. They noticed how quickly a Sherman could halt, pivot its turret, and resume its march. They marveled at how crews worked seamlessly with accompanying infantry. Radios crackled with coordination that France's 1940 army had never mastered. It was not just the tanks themselves, but the revolutionary way they were employed. Fast, relentless, always pressing forward, that astonished French observers completely. For those who joined the columns, riding atop the tanks or marching beside them, the feeling was one of disbelief slowly giving way to pure exhilaration. Each kilometer advanced erased a little more of the shame of 1940. Each German roadblock crushed under Sherman tracks reminded them that the age of helplessness was finally ending. French soldiers could scarcely reconcile the memory of broken, scattered armor with the reality of this mechanized tide rolling across their homeland. They whispered to one another that perhaps the Americans had discovered the secret that French military minds had somehow missed. That speed, not weight, was the true essence of modern armored warfare. By the time Shermans reached deeper into the French countryside, disbelief had hardened into absolute conviction. French soldiers who had once doubted now spoke openly of the tank's proven prowess in battle. French eyes had witnessed something that defied their darkest memories. American armor rolled forward with a rhythm that seemed to mock the chaos of 1940. These machines moved with purpose that cut through doubt like steel through paper. The endless procession of Sherman tanks stretched beyond what exhausted French soldiers could count. Each tank represented more than firepower. Each represented hope, reborn. The visual impact struck first and hardest. Column after column of American armor thundered past French positions. The sight overwhelmed men who remembered their own broken tanks littering roadsides 4 years earlier. These Sherman tanks moved in perfect formation. Their tracks churned earth with mechanical precision. Dust clouds rose behind them like monuments to unstoppable force. French soldiers stood transfixed by the sheer abundance of steel rolling before their eyes. The sound came next and carved itself into memory. This was not the desperate rattle of French machines from darker days. This was not the menacing clatter that had haunted their nightmares since German panzers first appeared. The Sherman engines produced something entirely different. A steady growl emerged from each machine. The rhythm pulsed like an industrial heartbeat. This mechanical thunder rolled through Normandy hedgerows with relentless certainty. French soldiers described it as the sound of destiny itself. The noise carried weight beyond mere mechanics. It announced not just movement, but unstoppable advance. Each engine note proclaimed that liberation had found its voice. The combined roar of dozens of tanks created a symphony of steel that drowned out doubt. Memory painted cruel contrasts in French minds. 4 years earlier, approaching panzers had meant terror absolute. The sound of German armor was death approaching on tracks. Stuka sirens screamed overhead, while French columns collapsed in choking smoke. That trauma lived deep in French bones. Even hardened resistance fighters flinched when distant engines first rumbled across the horizon in 1944. Old fears clawed at hearts that had learned to expect betrayal. Muscles tensed with remembered panic from days when tanks meant only destruction. But these approaching machines revealed different truth with each passing moment. These were not predators hunting French prey. These were allies carrying liberation on their steel backs. The sound grew clearer as columns drew near. This was not the harsh bark of conquest, but the steady purr of friendship. Combat revealed the Sherman's true genius in ways that parade ground displays never could. French fighters who joined American units gasped at how swiftly the tanks redeployed between positions. Villages where German defenders prepared careful ambushes became theaters of American mobility. The Sherman tanks never lumbered toward danger as French armor once had. They swung wide with fluid grace. They circled quickly like metal wolves. They struck from angles that enemy planners never anticipated. Infantry marching alongside marveled at seamless maneuvering through narrow streets. Turrets pivoted, while engines never stopped rumbling. The battle flowed like water around obstacles. This was not stop-and-start warfare, but rolling tide that surrendered momentum to no one. French observers found the tempo disorienting after years of static thinking. They had grown accustomed to armor being vulnerable and chained by logistics. They expected tanks to lumber and strain against terrain. But Americans treated their tanks like cavalry charging across open fields. The machines exploited gaps with predatory instinct. They never lingered long enough to become targets. A French officer attached to an American armored division struggled to process what he witnessed daily. Entire columns shifted positions faster than seemed possible. "They fight with motion," he reported in amazement, not with weight. This challenged everything French doctrine had taught about armored warfare. French military thinking in 1940 had prized heavy armor above all else. Deliberate engagements seemed more trustworthy than rapid movement. But Americans had rewritten every rule in the book. They proved that mobility killed as efficiently as any cannon. Speed became their most devastating weapon. The psychological impact of engine noise rippled through liberated territories like emotional shockwaves. Town after town reported the same phenomenon. Civilians and resistance fighters felt their spirits surge when they heard Sherman tanks before seeing them. The rumble rolled across fields and through valleys like a promise made of steel. To men who had lived under occupation's weight, this sound was liberation itself. It was an anthem of hope played by mechanical orchestras. French soldiers marching with the columns noticed how even German prisoners reacted with visible unease to the approaching thunder. Wehrmacht soldiers had been trained to fear swarming attacks and relentless pressure. The American rumble meant their careful battle plans were already crumbling. The sound alone announced that initiative was slipping from German hands. Fear spread through enemy ranks faster than the tanks themselves. Yet the Sherman's speed transcended mere physical movement. It represented strategic thinking that French military minds had never fully grasped. Supply trucks shadowed the columns with almost supernatural precision. Fuel and ammunition appeared exactly when needed. Mechanics repaired damaged machines in hours rather than days that French logistics required. Fresh tanks always waited to replace losses. French soldiers realized with growing awe that Americans had built more than fast armor. They had created an entire ecosystem designed to sustain speed indefinitely. This was industrial warfare perfected into mechanical poetry. The revelation cut deeper than machinery alone. This was education in how modern wars were actually won. French veterans of 1940 remembered tanks stalling for lack of fuel. They remembered machines abandoned for want of spare parts. They remembered armor sitting helpless without air support coordination. Now, in 1944, they witnessed synchronized orchestras of destruction. Tanks moved in harmony with trucks and artillery and aircraft, every element synchronized to a single tempo. The result seemed unstoppable because it carried destiny's weight in its momentum. By late summer, French soldiers had progressed beyond mere astonishment. They felt inspiration burning in their chests. The sound of Sherman tanks in motion became liberation's soundtrack. Victory's rhythm replaced defeat's echoes in their hearts and minds. Doubt slowly gave way to pride for those who had once questioned everything. They understood they marched alongside a force unlike any in history. Its power lay not just in steel, but in the speed of its very soul. Following the rolling thunder of American tanks deeper into their homeland, they knew the shadow of 1940 was finally beginning to lift. The true shock struck French soldiers not from watching American tanks roll past, but from invitations to climb aboard and fight alongside their crews. To sit atop a Sherman and feel engine vibrations surge through the steel frame was revelation beyond anything 1940 had offered. French armor from that earlier war had been ponderous and claustrophobic. Those machines demanded immense effort for limited gain. By contrast, the Sherman tanks radiated vitality that infected everyone who touched them. They were not delicate fortresses waiting to break down. They were hardy war horses, eager to devour roads ahead. French volunteers who joined American armored units in 1944 carried lingering doubts like old wounds. They remembered how quickly German panzers had outmaneuvered their forces. They worried that history might repeat its cruelest lessons. But Americans possessed confidence born not of arrogance, but of abundance. To French soldiers accustomed to scarcity and tension, the Americans' relaxed manner felt surreal. It was as if fighting wars with endless tanks and unlimited fuel had transformed battle into something routine. They approached combat like craftsmen approaching familiar work. Training sessions astonished French recruits beyond their wildest expectations. They learned to handle radios with previously unimaginable sophistication. They discovered how to coordinate movements with infantry in real time. They were taught to rely on speed rather than brute force for survival. For an army that had been paralyzed by poor communication in 1940, the idea of instant coordination was revolutionary. Within days, French soldiers who once dreaded tanks were learning to ride them with growing confidence. They marveled at how responsive Sherman tanks felt compared to their own lumbering relics. These machines could pivot swiftly on uneven ground. They could accelerate across terrain that would have stopped French armor cold. They sustained long marches without mechanical breakdowns that had plagued earlier campaigns. It was like being reintroduced to armored warfare's very concept. One French lieutenant never forgot his first mission with an American tank crew. He expected the vehicle to falter when crossing muddy terrain that had trapped French machines in 1940. Instead, the Sherman plowed forward without hesitation. Its tracks gripped earth with steady determination that defied his experience. He had braced himself for failure because memories of abandoned French armor littering roadsides in 1940 haunted his dreams. But when the Sherman crested the hill and kept moving forward, he felt wonder that seemed almost childlike. "It was alive," he wrote later, "as if it carried us on its shoulders, invincible and unstoppable." Americans encouraged French crews to trust the tempo of their machines completely. "Keep moving," one U.S. sergeant explained, "and you'll live. Stop moving, and you become a target." This philosophy resonated deeply with men who had suffered under doctrines of static defense. French soldiers realized their allies treated tanks as cavalry designed to flow across battlefields in sweeping maneuvers. To fight alongside such speed was intoxicating beyond description. For the first time in years, French soldiers felt not like relics of defeated armies, but like riders of new unstoppable forces. Even smallest details impressed men who had learned to expect disappointment. Spare parts were always available when needed. Fuel convoys seemed endless and reliable. Ammunition never ran short during critical moments. Americans had built complete ecosystems to support their armor. French soldiers were stunned by the efficiency that seemed to mock their own experience. They compared it bitterly to 1940, when tanks ran dry or broke down with no support visible anywhere. Now, when Sherman tanks were damaged, mechanics swarmed over them like surgeons. Machines returned to fighting condition within hours. To French eyes, this seemed like sorcery or industrial magic. The disbelief, however, was not purely technical in nature. It was emotional and spiritual. French soldiers climbing onto Sherman tanks felt they were climbing out of 1940's shadows forever. Every kilometer traveled with Americans was a symbolic journey away from defeat toward redemption. They began shedding humiliation's weight and replacing it with fierce determination to reclaim lost honor. Riding with Sherman tanks, they no longer felt like spectators of liberation. They felt like its authors. By autumn of 1944, French units equipped with American tanks began taking part in offensives independently. This proved that lessons had been absorbed completely. Yet even as they fought, many admitted privately that they struggled to believe their experiences were real. After years of despair, the sight of France advancing behind fast, unstoppable tanks felt almost too miraculous. But engine sounds beneath them and momentum of steel under their command silenced all remaining doubts. The nightmare of helplessness was ending. French forces were riding into history atop giants of American armored power. By late summer of 1944, disbelief had transformed into something more visceral and powerful: fury. For French soldiers fighting alongside American armored divisions, Sherman's speed was no longer simply curiosity or marvel. It was a weapon of living force that carried them into battles where momentum became the deciding factor. They had watched columns stream across Normandy, liberating villages in hours rather than days. Now they were part of operations where American tanks moved so swiftly that German defenses crumbled before reorganizing. For French fighters who had endured 4 years of humiliation, this was not just war. This was revenge delivered with steel and fire. One joint operation near Paris left indelible marks on many French observers. German units had dug into defensive positions with confidence that narrow streets and barricades would stall any Allied armor. In 1940, such obstacles had indeed spelled disaster for French forces, whose tanks had bogged down in confusion and isolation. But Sherman tanks approached differently than anything Germans had faced. They did not slow to form cumbersome lines of attack. They surged forward in columns that pivoted around obstacles with fluid grace. They smashed through weaker points while circling defenders with astonishing speed. French infantry moving with the armor were stunned at how quickly situations flipped from dangerous to victorious. Within hours, Strong points that might have resisted for days were bypassed and neutralized. Germans who once seemed invincible now looked clumsy and reactive. For French forces, the effect was electrifying beyond mere tactical success. These were not just victories on battlefields. They were acts of national redemption written in fire and steel. Every German retreat erased fragments of shame from 1940. Every abandoned position restored French pride. Every broken enemy line seemed to heal wounds that had festered for 4 long years. Sherman's speed was not merely tactical advantage, it was psychological resurrection. It allowed French soldiers to reclaim dominance they had thought lost forever. They were no longer victims of blitzkrieg tactics. They were riding one. The fury of liberation was perhaps most visible when French units finally entered Paris in August 1944. Though much fighting was carried out by resistance forces inside the city, the arrival of Free French tanks equipped with American armor provided symbolic weight of total victory. Civilians lined boulevards, throwing flowers and crying tears of pure joy. But soldiers atop those tanks felt something deeper than celebration. They felt disbelief that they were here in their capital, not as prisoners or fugitives, but as victors. Many recalled Sherman tanks that had carried them through hedgerows and villages. The rumble of engines had become liberation's rhythm, replacing defeat's echoes. Without that speed and relentless momentum, they knew Paris might have remained under occupation far longer. American armor had provided not just firepower, but hope itself. On other fronts, the fury turned into ruthless efficiency that impressed even veteran American crews. French crews driving American tanks fought in Lorraine and Alsace, where they confronted German armor on more equal terms. They saw firsthand the danger of Tiger and Panther tanks. These German machines could destroy Sherman tanks with single devastating shots. Yet the lesson had been learned completely. Speed was survival absolute. French and American crews maneuvered their Sherman tanks like wolf packs, circling and flanking their prey. They never allowed heavier German tanks to dominate battlefields through superior firepower alone. What astonished French crews was not just that these tactics worked, but that they were sustainable indefinitely. There were always more Sherman tanks available. There was always more fuel flowing forward. There were always more reinforcements arriving. This was a kind of war France had never been able to wage successfully. A war of abundance, where speed and numbers crushed fearsome but isolated giants. For men who had once cowered before German panzers, the transformation was profound beyond description. They no longer felt powerless when engines rumbled in the distance. Instead, they felt anticipation, knowing that Sherman thunder meant attack rather than retreat. The disbelief lingered like smoke from old fires. It was hard to reconcile broken memories of 1940 with furious momentum of 1944. But disbelief was now mingled with pride that burned in French chests. French soldiers began believing their army, reborn in American steel, could reclaim honor not only in France, but across all of Europe. The fury of 1944 was not blind rage seeking destruction. It was focused and disciplined and sharpened by years of suffering under occupation. Riding alongside Sherman tanks, French soldiers learned that speed could be vengeance itself. Mobility became a form of justice delivered on steel tracks. Every village liberated was proof that France was rising again. Every road retaken demonstrated renewed strength. Every German unit scattered showed that defeat could be reversed. With each new victory, French soldiers who had once doubted could no longer deny truth. America's fast tanks had not only changed battlefields forever, they had changed France itself from a defeated nation into a force of liberation. As autumn of 1944 turned into winter, French soldiers who had marched and fought and ridden alongside Americans began understanding they were witnessing more than military campaigns. They were seeing revolution in warfare itself. The shock they had first felt, watching endless Sherman columns roll across Normandy, had matured into recognition. These machines and the doctrine that animated them represented new philosophy of battle completely. No longer was armored warfare a contest of lumbering giants trading blows. It was a dance of mobility and logistics and coordination that flowed like deadly music. French soldiers, who had once doubted, now found themselves disciples of this new creed. The lessons revealed themselves everywhere French eyes looked. In Lorraine, French units fighting with American support watched Sherman tanks bypass German strong points instead of hammering uselessly against them. The tanks moved swiftly across rivers on temporary bridges erected almost overnight. Their pace remained relentless, regardless of obstacles. French officers could hardly believe the tempo of such operations. Where their 1940 manuals had spoken of deliberate methodical advances, Americans demonstrated the power of fluid movement. They struck one day in one direction. The next day, they attacked 50 kilometers away. For French soldiers, this was nothing short of revelation about warfare's true nature. Even when setbacks came during bitter fighting in the Ardennes during December, French observers noticed crucial differences. Germans still relied on sudden armored thrusts, hoping to replicate 1940's shock. But Americans absorbed the blows and regrouped and unleashed their tanks in counterattacks with astonishing speed. French units who fought alongside them were stunned by the system's resilience. Where French army of 1940 had collapsed after first hammer blows, the Allies now rebounded with mechanical precision. This proved that mobility and logistics could withstand even fiercest German assaults. American armor was not just fast. It was durable and replaceable and supported by industrial might that seemed limitless. This was warfare transformed from art into science. By early 1945, French soldiers were not merely observers of American tank warfare. They were practitioners learning every lesson. French armored divisions re-equipped with Sherman tanks advanced through Alsace and into Germany itself. The disbelief of 1944 had transformed into something else entirely. Conviction burned in French hearts like purifying fire. They believed in the system because they had seen it work under every condition. They carried those lessons into their own doctrine that would reshape French military thinking. Speed and coordination and supply had become holy trinity of modern warfare. The transformation went deeper than tactics or technology could explain. For men who had survived 1940 and fought in resistance and then joined armored thrusts of liberation, fast American tanks became symbols of redemption itself. Riding Sherman tanks into liberated towns, they felt humiliation of defeat being burned away by fire of momentum. They realized that armor could be not only tool of conquerors, but instrument of freedom. The disbelief that had once haunted their dreams became pride that shaped rebirth of French army and nation. Victory was not just possible. It was inevitable when speed and steel worked in harmony. After the war, when French officers wrote their reports and soldiers told their stories, one theme returned again and again like a sacred refrain: speed. They marveled at how Americans had taught them that tanks were not just fortresses on tracks, but weapons of movement itself. They were engines of tempo that could change history's course. Many admitted they had never truly believed it until they had seen Sherman tanks surge across their homeland faster than fear itself, faster than doubt, faster even than memory of defeat. Thus, the legacy of 1944 was not only liberation, but transformation of French military soul. The French soldier, once broken by memory of blitzkrieg, had learned new kind of warfare from his allies. America's fast tanks had shown him that victory came not from standing still, but from never stopping, from keeping thunder of engines rolling until enemies collapsed in exhaustion. What had begun as disbelief in 1944 ended as doctrine for the future. In that journey from humiliation to astonishment to conviction, French soldiers found not only new way of war, but restored sense of dignity that would endure forever.